good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
We made it through the morning. Have to admit that I made a mistake. Here we go again. Yes. Last week I said that next year is the 75th anniversary of the Ten Commandments movie. And I was a freshman in high school. And then all of a sudden I thought, oh my gosh, that really makes me old. So it is the 70th anniversary next year. And I was 15, so now but I'm still only 84, so not until next year will we have to worry about being old. And today we're back to our journey with Jesus. We're going to jump back and forth again as we've been doing. We're going back a couple of weeks to where we left off with Jesus in Jerusalem. It was the fall, right after the Transfiguration. Jesus was at the Festival of Tabernacles. Two things we want to remember before we go on from that time in Jesus' journey. First was the bitter opposition that Jesus faced from the temple leaders. Secondly, was the healing of the blind man, one of the most interesting stories in John's Gospel, one of the few Bible stories that go into great detail, including what happened afterwards. And it turns out that the healing of the blind man simply escalated the tension and the friction between Jesus and the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem. That was all in the fall. But then Jesus would come back to Jerusalem in the middle of the winter, in December, this time for the Festival of Dedication. Dedication is not something that we're familiar with. It has nothing to do with any of the Old Testament traditions or Bible stories that we're familiar with, because the Festival of Dedication took place at an event that happened in between the Testaments, after the Old Testament had ended, so there's nothing about it in our Bibles. We have to remember, and this is something that a lot of people don't realize, just going through your Bible, especially if you read the Bible in a year or something like that, we usually lose track of time, and we lose sight of the fact that 400 years passed between the end of the Old Testament and the birth of Christ, or as we would say, 400 years between Malachi and Matthew. And if that strikes an interest, you might also want to note that there was 400 years between Genesis and Exodus. So there was a parallel for this already early in the Bible. The Old Testament ended with the rebuilding of the temple after the Babylonian captivity. This was during the time of the great Persian Empire. In fact, the Persians not only sent the Israelites back to Judea, the Persians paid for the rebuilding of Jerusalem and the rebuilding of the temple. But then the Persian Empire fell. The Greeks took over, and the Greeks under Alexander the Great ruled the world. Eventually, the Greek Empire would fall to the Romans. But the Romans were wise enough to preserve a great deal of Greek culture instead of trying to start everything all over again, including the Greek language that the Bible would be written in. It was this period of history in between the Testaments that we have the Apocrypha, the books that were written during the 400 years between the Old Testament and the New Testament. You may be familiar, or at least you might be aware, that these books are in the Roman Catholic Bible, but they're not in our Bibles. And you may be wondering why. That's a good question. And if we go back to the Reformation, Luther translated the Greek Bible into German in 1521. 90 years later, in 1611, the Church of England produced the King James Bible, and both Luther's German Bible and the King James Bible left the Apocrypha out, simply because of the fact that during the time that these books were being written, during that 400 years, the Jewish people never accepted them as scripture, or as what they would have said as prophecy. And as a result, because they were left out of the Hebrew Bible, they were left out of the Old Testament, Luther left them out of the German Bible, and they were left out of the King James Bible, and it's been that way ever since. Anyway, about 150 years before the birth of Jesus, long after the time of the Old Testament and the Old Testament prophets, the Greeks put an evil king in charge of Palestine, just like the Romans would put Herod in charge of Palestine at the time of the birth of Jesus. That evil king that the Greeks put into power desecrated the temple, literally mocked everything that had been holy, even poured pig's blood on the altar, and the Jewish people rebelled. Led by three brothers called the Maccabees. You may have heard of Maccabees Insurance. This is where it comes from. By the way, it's a Jewish company. For a time, the Maccabees soldiers actually restored freedom and independence. For this is a revolution, just like revolutions go on all the time, and just like one happened here in 1776. It was a revolution against Greek rule, and for a time, the Israelis won and had independence. They decided to rededicate the temple after the desecration by the Greeks. And that began what they would then call the Festival of Dedication. During this rededication, the Maccabees ran into a problem. They had in the temple what was called the eternal flame, a lamp that would burn for 8 days at a time before it needed to be refilled with oil. Many churches still use 7 or 8 day candles in their chancels as a remembrance of this biblical tradition. Well, they got all ready to celebrate the rededication of the temple, and somebody said, we're out of oil. They only had enough oil left for 1 day. And the Maccabees brothers said, we've come this far, we're not going to stop now. Go ahead, light it. And that lamp miraculously stayed burning for 8 days until they could find a new supply of oil. And that became the Festival of Dedication, or as we know it today, Hanukkah. And of course, we know because it was Hanukkah that it was celebrated in December. So here we are, from fall to December to spring. We're halfway through the 6 months that it took Jesus to come from Transfiguration to Palm Sunday. So Jesus returned to Jerusalem in December for the Festival of Dedication. Once again, there was a confrontation with the Jewish leaders, and once again, Jesus showed up in the temple, this time best known for saying, I am the good shepherd and the gate for the sheep. That was the festival of dedication. And then at the end of that week, Jesus left the temple for the last time. Jesus would not return to the temple until Palm Sunday, actually the day after Palm Sunday, when he would chase the money changers out of the temple again. So what we're looking at today is what happened between December, when Jesus left the temple at dedication, and April, when he would arrive for Palm Sunday. We know that Jesus is going to come back in March for the funeral of Lazarus. That's our whole Bible study next week is going to be about the funeral of Lazarus, John 11. But today we're going to look at the time in between, from December until March. And for that, we are going to leave the Gospel of John temporarily and turn to the Gospel of Luke. What Jesus did during those 3 months between dedication and the funeral of Lazarus is only found in Luke. It's kind of amazing that Luke includes this, but doesn't mention any of the other stuff that we've been talking about since Transfiguration, all of the times that Jesus spent in Jerusalem, and so forth and so on. We don't know why Luke chose to include this portion of the life of Jesus, but we're glad he did, because he gave us one of the most cherished and beloved stories in all of the Bible. After the festival of dedication, Jesus left the temple for the last time, and he went to the area that we know as Perea. It's the green area on your map across the Jordan River, across the border, we might add. In other words, he was now free from the jurisdiction of the Sanhedrin and the temple leaders by crossing the Jordan and entering Perea. This region is known in other parts of the Bible as the wilderness. This is where Jesus went after he was baptized by John the Baptist, and he spent 40 days being tempted by Satan, and that's the 40 days that give us the 40 days of Lent. Why we're here today. Have we talked about this? How many days are there between Ash Wednesday and Easter? 46, because the Sundays don't count. So if you're fasting during Lent, you can do what you want on Sunday. Just so you know that. Anyway, Jesus crosses the Jordan into Perea, but this is hardly what we would call wilderness. There were a lot of towns and villages. There were a lot of Jewish people who, for whatever reason, were living outside of the Holy Land. Of course, we know from the Pentecost story that by the start of the New Testament, Jews were living all over the world and still came back to Jerusalem for Pentecost. As a matter of fact, one of the first people that Jesus visits in Perea is a Pharisee who, not living in Jerusalem. That kind of surprising in itself, but still a Pharisee. And he invites Jesus to dinner. And the dinner becomes a banquet. It attracts the attention of the whole village. This leads to a discussion with all of these people here. Who is going to get to sit at the top of the table, the seat of honor? And Jesus responds to this question, this gossip, with a parable, typical of most of the parables that Jesus would teach, prompted by this issue. And Jesus tells a parable about a king who chooses to have a banquet, and he invites people who would be expected to be invited, who would expect the invitation, but they're too busy. They didn't want to come. They beg off with all kinds of excuses. And you know how this parable ends. The king says, "Go to the highways and the byways and bring them in." The people who would never be expected to be part of a banquet at the king's table. The lesson was simple. Jesus was going to open the gates of heaven to all. And those who had been invited first would find themselves on the outside looking in. And instead, you would find these people from the highways and the byways. And that sets the stage for Luke chapter 15, one of the most important chapters in the Bible, a chapter that begins with the words, "Now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus, but the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, 'This man welcomes sinners and eats with them.'" And right here, I guess we would say, in a nutshell, this sets the parables, the Bible stories in Luke 15, apart from all of the other stories in John and apart from almost all of the other parables that Jesus would tell. Jesus is not in Jerusalem arguing with the temple leaders in the midst of all of this hostility and bitterness. Now Jesus is with people who like him, and he likes them. Tax collectors and sinners. Does anyone here work for the Internal Revenue Service? He's not talking about them or about you. Tax collectors or publicans in the Bible were Jews who chose to work for the Romans collecting taxes. The Romans believed that if they could find local people who knew the people in their community, they would know who would be expected to pay more taxes and so forth and so on. And the locals could take their hatred out on them instead of on the Roman soldiers. The publicans were the lowest of the low, the worst of the worst. Who was the most famous publican in the New Testament? Matthew. Matthew, who wrote Matthew, Levi, was a publican. There's another publican that we're going to meet in 2 weeks, Zacchaeus. You remember Vacation Bible School? Zacchaeus was a wee little man. A wee little man was he. 2 more weeks. But for now, let's focus on Luke 15. Jesus is talking to people like him, who like him, and he tells them 3 stories: the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the lost son. The prodigal son, who Pastor Gore has been talking to you about all through Lent. The prodigal son was the gospel reading last Sunday, so we're not going to go into detail about these stories. Pastor Gore can give you all of that, but I do want to point out one thing. All 3 of these parables had a happy ending. And if you stop and think about it for a moment, that sets these parables apart from virtually everything else Jesus ever did. Most of the parables that Jesus told were warnings of impending doom to the audience, especially the parables that Jesus told in Jerusalem. But here in Perea, Jesus is with people who like him, and he likes them. And Jesus stays in Perea for a while. We know he was in Jerusalem for dedication, Hanukkah. We know he'll be back in March for the funeral of Lazarus, but for now, he's going to stay away. But he uses this opportunity to continue teaching. The next chapter in Luke is a series of parables, and the last one of those being one of the most familiar parables from him, not as familiar as the prodigal son, but it's a story that you know, the story of the rich man and Lazarus. And this parable is unique for a couple of reasons. For one thing, Jesus is talking about heaven, and everybody wants to know what it's going to be like in heaven. In the story, Lazarus goes to heaven when he dies, and Abraham himself comes and takes care of him. The rich man dies and goes to hell, but he is able to talk to Abraham and Lazarus in heaven. We have an animated version of this story, so let's just watch that right now.
There was a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen and lived in luxury every day. At his gate was laid a beggar named Lazarus, covered with sores and longing to eat what fell from the rich man's table. Even the dogs came and licked his sores. The time came when the beggar died, and the angels carried him to Abraham's side. The rich man also died and was buried. In hell, where he was in torment, he looked up and saw Abraham far away, with Lazarus by his side. So he called to him, "Father Abraham, have pity on me, and send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, because I am in agony in this fire." But Abraham replied, "Son, remember that in your lifetime you received your good things, while Lazarus received bad things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in agony. And besides all this, between us and you, a great chasm has been fixed, so that those who want to go from here to you cannot, nor can anyone cross over from there to us." He answered, "Then I beg you, Father, send Lazarus to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers. Let him warn them, so that they will not also come to this place of torment." Abraham replied, "They have Moses and the prophets. Let them listen to them." "No, Father Abraham," he said, "but if someone from the dead goes to them, they will repent." He said to him, "If they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, they will not be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead."
The details in this story are so vivid, it would be easy for people to take the story literally, and some people do, as though it really happened. But it was a parable, just a parable. The second thing that's unique about this story is Lazarus himself. In every other parable, Jesus talks about a king or a father or the older son or the younger son or a Samaritan. But in this story that Jesus tells, and the only parable in which Jesus does this, Lazarus is named. And it's very unique. And it's a very unique coincidence. Just 1 month later, maybe even less, in Bethany, Jesus would raise Lazarus from the dead. Isn't it amazing that in Luke, while he is in Perea, Jesus tells a story about a man named Lazarus, and a month later in John's gospel, we meet the real Lazarus. And that's where we will start next week. Jesus and the real Lazarus, and Jesus saying, I am the resurrection and the life.